Good evening and welcome. I'm Susan Engel, Director of 92nd Street Y Talks. Welcome to this last, but certainly not least, in our 2013 In the News series with Jeff Greenfield. As I'm sure those of you who have attended our previous sessions will agree, it's been an illuminating series this year with the kind of conversation sorely needed in our country today. We are very grateful to our moderator and host for this series for elevating the level of dialogue around these political issues and contributing to all of us being more informed citizens. We have also just announced our May-June programs and have many fascinating speakers added to our roster. Allow me to highlight just two of the many conversations that I'm sure you won't want to miss. On May 28th, Tom Brokaw will be in conversation with Phil Donahue. And then on June 27th, General David Petraeus will be interviewed by Charlie Rose. I encourage you to visit our website, www.92y.org, to ensure your admission, purchase your tickets in advance, and also to keep updated on frequent program announcements. Now back to tonight. Our moderator is an Emmy award-winning journalist with over 40 years of impressive credentials to his name, making him the best in the business. And for over 30 years, he has been here with us with this marvelous series. He is now a Yahoo News columnist and anchor of PBS's Need to Know. His new book, An Alternate History, entitled If JFK Lived, will be published this fall. Ladies and gentlemen, our very good friend, Mr. Jeff Greenfield.
Good evening to those of you here and to those of you watching this on 92y.org/livecast. Good Wife has not started yet. So. And with the golf, it won't be on till, I don't know, midnight, so stick around. I noted a couple of times that all our guests here share a first name, but as they say on late-night TV ads, wait, there's more. Just like last week's guest, David Brooks, David Axelrod grew up in Stuyvesant Town. And, okay. And if you want to know why they both possess a kind of cool, phlegmatic demeanor, it's if you grew up without air conditioning, you had to learn how to stay cool. They also both went to the University of Chicago. David's dad was a psychologist. David's mom, Merle Bennett, wrote for PM, which was a newspaper of decidedly liberal left sensibilities, something that fortunately for David Axelrod, Sarah Palin did not stumble across back in 2008. But he put down his roots in Chicago. He began a career in journalism with the Chicago Tribune and instead turned to the work of politics, worked for Paul Simon, not the singer, but the senator, and gained special attention for his work with any number of black candidates seeking to run in mostly white constituencies. Harold Washington, the first black mayor of Chicago, Michael White of Cleveland, Lee Brown of Houston, which actually turned out to be of some use in his future career. And by 2008, having worked in campaigns so long, he faced an unusual dilemma. He knew virtually every serious Democratic candidate running for president that year, but as you may know, he chose to throw in his lot with a figure he'd known for, at that point, I think for a decade and a half, Senator Barack Obama. And as a, if not the senior campaign aide, then as a key White House aide, then in 2012 as a senior strategist, he has been as central a figure in the Obama administration and the presidency as anyone. Now he's stepped away. He's become the director of an institute that he helped found at his alma mater, the director of the University of Chicago Institute of Politics. He's also signed on to be a contributor to NBC and MSNBC. As the president said last night at the Nerd Prom, David now works for MSNBC, which is only fair since all last year the president said MSNBC worked for him. So it is with genuine delight that I introduce to you the Honorable David Axelrod. So welcome.
Thank you. Great to be back.
That's right. This is not his first appearance here. For some unaccountable reason, he was here without me. There are matters political and substantive to get to, but there are a couple of things I want to touch on first.
Okay.
That call them extra credit. Okay.
All right.
First, you worked for John Edwards and you worked for Elliot Spitzer. Any chance you'd be joining Anthony Weiner's mayoral campaign?
I feel like I'm overexposed in that regard. I'm not gonna do that.
That's worthy of a New York Post headline. Second, this is actually a matter.
But thanks for mentioning those.
Yeah, well, I knew you'd appreciate it right off the bat. You're too sweet to walk out.
Now you asked me why you weren't here the other two times.
And we've only just started. But the second thing I wanted to find out from you is, so for 6 years or more, kind of every day, every time the phone rang, every time your email beeped, every time they said breaking news, on a cable network, it had to be right at the top of your mind. What does this mean? Are we going to have a problem with the campaign? Is there some crisis? Now you are in the groves of academe. Are you now, when you hear that, say, not my problem? Or are you like the old fire horse, when the bell rings, is your first instinct to say, what do I do about this?
Yeah, that's deeply ingrained. And you'll appreciate this. I started as a newspaper reporter, you mentioned that. And for 2 years, I was on nights at the Chicago Tribune. And because they wanted me to learn how to be a reporter, they knew I knew a lot about politics, cared a lot about it, but they wanted me to learn how to be a reporter, and so I covered, murder and mayhem, which was actually good preparation for politics in Chicago. But even to this day, if I'm driving along and I see a plane and it looks like it's sort of listing in the wrong direction, I'm like steering my wheel there, thinking that I should be calling in the story. And I feel a little bit the same way now when I see things happen. I do think about the implications of it, but I feel a certain sense of relief knowing that the president is never going to run for re-election now. And so, when for the last 2 years, when I saw those stories, my thoughts were about how is this going to impact on the election? And it's nice to be free of that concern.
And you can.
Yeah.
Lastly, a question that you must be so heartily sick of, but you're here, and as I say, it's too early to leave, and somebody's going to ask this if I don't. What the hell happened?
I'm going to leave when The Good Wife comes on.
Trust me, they'll have a playoff. But here's the question. What the hell happened in the first debate?
It's funny. It's the first time I've been asked that.
Think about it. I like to think of myself on the cutting edge of journalism.
Yeah. You're talking about 2008 or 2012. What happened was that, first of all, we always had that, in my own mind and among my colleagues, we always had that date circled on the calendar as a potential problem. And you, as a student of history, know that it has almost invariably, except with rare exception, been a problem for incumbent presidents, these first presidential debates, because it's been 4 years since they had to debate an opponent, and the opponent has been debating regularly during their primaries, and now you've got a guy sitting this close, or almost this close, and right in your grill. And presidents don't like that. They're not used to it. They're unaccustomed to it, and the general history has been bad. You remember Ronald Reagan flubbed his first debate, and there were a few days of exhilaration in the Mondale camp before disaster came. And
G.W. Bush had a bad first debate.
Yeah. Actually, second and third as well. But but the first one was particularly bad. So we knew that this was going to be a challenge. I think we also, in retrospect, prepared him the wrong way And I felt that way. I had this nagging feeling because he was asking for a lot of paper and we were giving it to him, and like 1,000 pages of it, and he'd write back 45 questions that he wanted answered and so on, like we were preparing for oral exams. And that's not what debates are. Debates are essentially performances. And Romney prepared for a performance, and our guy prepared for sort of a joint press conference. And that's the way it played. And the other thing that was working against us on that debate was that we had an unexpectedly good September. We went into the conventions. We had done a lot of work to define the race, and we went into the conventions ahead. But we had a good convention. They had a bad convention. Read Clint Eastwood. And then also in September came the 47% tape. And so by the time we got to the debates, where we had been running a 3 to 4 point lead in the battleground states, now we had a 6 or 7 point lead. And I think that psychologically everyone was just a little loose. I think the president's attitude was, let's just survive this thing. We just need a draw.
It's like it's a four-corner offense in basketball.
Exactly, always bad.
Yeah.
And so those things, all of those elements were at play. None of us we didn't have very good preps going in. None of us felt good flying to Denver. You always, and you've been involved in this process, so you know. And by the way, one of the reasons why I'm so pleased to be here is Jeff is someone, I really admire him as a journalist, but I also appreciate the fact that he's been a practitioner in politics as well. And I think one of the reasons he was and is a great political journalist and commentator is because he's been on the other side and understands the process. So you've seen these before, and you get ready for these debates, and you prep for these debates, and the goal is to know exactly what your guy's going to say. If you hear a question, you want as a group, as you're watching it together in whatever room behind the stage you're at, you want to know, okay, here's where he's going to do this. We never had that sense in the first debate. We didn't know because he never answered a question precisely the same way.
I actually thought one of the things in watching the debate, right off the get-go, when the president acknowledged it was his anniversary, and then Romney very graciously said, "I'm sure that this is exactly where you wanted to be on your anniversary,
right,
standing on a stage with me," and that was my first reaction, going, "Oh, he may
well,
actually..."
and we at my institute, the Romney people, we did a 5-week review of the presidential race, and the strategist for Romney came out, and we had a session on the debates, and as it turns out, Senator Portman, who was playing Obama and is very good at that, he's made a career of being the stand-in in Republican debate preps, kind of a Sybil-like quality, but he divined he knew that he had read that it was the president's anniversary, and so he did. So that was, as with much of what Romney did that night, that was well rehearsed. He heard it, and they knew what he was going to say. I thought the president didn't particularly deliver that line well.
He just looked like he didn't want to be there.
Right.
So my question...
I think that was a fair surmise.
But clearly one of the things that you guys did that I thought was both necessary and smart is you didn't try to spin that debate. You said, you basically said, we had a bad night.
Yeah.
Not that...
Well, we considered the other options, and they didn't seem viable.
Right. I'll just tell you a quick story. After the Dukakis-Bush debate, when Dukakis asked about what he'd do if his wife was raped and murdered,
yes,
gave a answer on Swedish land planning.
Yes.
And I was interviewing a Democratic strategist after who tried to spin me. I said, that was a pretty disastrous answer. And he started to say, oh, no, we thought it really humanized Dukakis. And I stopped the interview. I said, Bob, I can't do this to you because you're going to look like a horse's ass.
That was nice of you. I had a reporter.
I didn't say that on camera.
When I was the City Hall bureau chief for the Chicago Tribune, there was a an old sort of Runyon-esque character named Harry Golden Jr., whose father, Harry Golden Sr., some may remember.
Carolina Israelite, only in America.
Exactly.
You don't think this audience knows this?
No, I do. You said this is, I heard in the introduction that this was to help you become better informed, and I know that this is a very informed audience to begin with. But Harry Golden Jr. was quite the character, and he had this big raspy voice, and sometimes there'd be a press scrum, and someone would say something completely preposterous. Harry would just snap his notebook shut, and he'd say, "That's not even true enough to print," and he'd walk away. So.
But what I'm getting at here is, either after that first debate or in any other moment in the fall, was there a moment when you were genuinely concerned that the president's reelection was in jeopardy?
No, absolutely not. I felt, look, everything, you don't really know at that moment, but we had a 6 or 7 point lead going in. I knew we would take a hit, and we would be, at that point we were in polling every night. So it's like medicine. You look at all the vital signs and see where you're at. And by Sunday, we had lost the points we had gotten, the 3 points we had gotten after the convention, and we were back to a 3 to 4 point race. And we never saw any erosion after that. There was this mythology, largely because public polling is so flawed and there's so much eagerness for a race. There was this, and the Romney people were propagating this notion that there was this big surge going on. Romney got back a lot of independent voters who were Republican-leaning, who were really his voters, and were just disenchanted by the convention and the 47% thing, partly because they felt he looked like a loser. And that night he didn't look like a loser, and those people came back. And the people who were most upset about it, and I bet you there are 1 or 2 in this room, were people in our own base. I mean,
they weren't going to leave
the
you.
aforementioned MSNBC was,
yes,
was in high.
It was
high dudgeon.
They were wearing black, I think, for 4 days.
And Andrew Sullivan was, jumping off a tall building, and it was, so the biggest problem we had in the aftermath of that debate was just calming down people who felt like the end was here.
So when you were watching all of the folks on my side of it, particularly the ones who were saying, my gut is telling me it's Romney, I can feel it. The portents are there, the crowds are huge, which is my favorite. Since George McGovern drew enormous crowds in 1972. That's always a good sign. Definitely. And he's going to take Pennsylvania, and here comes the landslide, which was Dick Morris, who is in a class by himself.
Yes.
Special ed, I think. Sorry, politically incorrect, but I don't have to worry anymore either. But were you tempted to call these people and say, would you like to, in Romney's phrase, $10,000 bet on this election?
Well, I made a bet on this election. That's why I don't have a mustache anymore. That's actually how it came about, was because they were spinning so vigorously that they were on the move. And I was on a show with Joe Scarborough, and he said, well, now you're losing Pennsylvania, and you're losing, you're falling
Michigan, Wisconsin,
Michigan, and Minnesota. And I said, Joe, if we lose any of those states, I will shave my mustache off on your show, my mustache of 40 years. And I said, but if we win Florida or North Carolina, no, I said, but if we win those states, you've got to grow one. And he said, well, no, but if you win either Florida or North Carolina, then I will do that. So I ended up winning the bet. And then we doubled down, and he said if I could raise $1 million for epilepsy research, which is close to me, by the end of December, that I still would shave my mustache off, and we were able to do that. So here I am.
So okay. So at every stage, because of your confidence in what you were seeing, you were pretty sure, barring obviously the weird events. But here's the question. David Plouffe, whom you may know, was here a month ago and took us through in some fascinating detail what I call, he didn't like the phrase, I don't know a better one, the machinery of your campaign. Mm-hmm. The fact that on election day you were so sophisticated that you were sending out notices to people in California on Facebook, here are your friends in competitive states that hadn't voted.
Right.
Well, my question is, how central was this.
Which was nice for the Californians to be able to participate in the campaign.
Yeah. But my point is, was this the central reason why he was reelected, or was it marginal? In other words, if unemployment had been 10%, if there'd been negative economic growth, if we were back in a recession, could you have saved Obama's presidency by the fact that you had a much more sophisticated voter
No,
network?
and I think that is widely misunderstood. It was important. There's no doubt that the melding of modern technology with old sort of grassroots politics was the key in 2008. It was, and we revolutionized it again in 2012, and that was important. But I always liken it to the field goal team. It's great to have a great field goal team who can come in and win the game, but you have to be, if you're on your own 20-yard line, it doesn't matter what kind of field goal team you have. In other words, you have to have the kind of messaging. Your fundamental strategy has to be good enough so that you can affect these things at the margins, which is what all this technology did. And I think the Republican Party today is trying to comfort itself in the notion that if we just had, some of these geeks, analytics kids like they had, that we would have won the election. No, they wouldn't have won the election. Now, were there any circumstances under which Obama could have lost? Of course. I don't know what, yes, if we had gone up, if unemployment had kept growing instead of coming down. We got a great break when it hit 7.8 on the last report right before the election. But this is an interesting point because we had a much different, we knew the election was about the economy. We stipulated that. We just had a much different view of how people were viewing the economy than the Republicans did. They had a very linear view that it was all about unemployment. And what we had done very, very exhaustive research, ethnographic studies where people wrote in diaries and all kinds of work on how people were thinking about the economy. And what we found is what others have found subsequent to that, and that is that there's a much deeper concern about the economy than the day-to-day numbers, and that is this seemingly inexorable pressure on the middle class, changes in the economy that have eroded the middle class, have made economic mobility much more difficult. Technology and globalization have taken a huge toll, and not just over the last few years, but over the last few decades, and that continues. And that's the fundamental challenge of our time. So speaking to that was for us what the economic debate was all about. And the Romney people never got that.
I also think that the fact that the direction of the economy, however limping, was kind of getting marginally better.
Yes. It impeached their fundamental argument. When you link yourself to one measure like that, I would appear on platforms with Republican speakers throughout the campaign, and every month they would say, well, Obama's lost, we've lost 1.7 million jobs since he's been president. Then I'd see one other guy from their campaign a month later say, we've lost 1.4 million jobs since then. And, then it was, we've lost 900,000 jobs. And finally I said, you guys aren't going to have a talking point by election day. And that's what happened. And they've been very, candid in the sort of autopsies of the campaign. Eric Fernstrom, who's a senior figure in the Romney campaign, at our forum in Chicago, said, look, when he declared, unemployment was at 10.2%. And when election day rolled around, it was at 7.8%. He said things were getting better, and it was very hard not to acknowledge that fact.
So one more thing about the past, and then I want to move to where we are now. But one of the things that I thought was that you guys got a huge break in the lineup that the other guys were presenting. That if Romney was the most plausible compared to, Herman Cain, Newt Gingrich, Michelle Bachmann, Rick Santorum. But Romney, who I claim credit with many other people, labeling him as the Thurston Howell III candidate, that if you know your Gilligan's Island history, folks, that in a time of economic uncertainty and concern, to nominate that kind
Right.
of rich guy.
Yes.
So my question is, as you looked at the broader field was there any Republican potential candidate there about whom you guys went, that could be a problem for us?
Yeah, I mean, I thought, for example, Mitch Daniels, the governor of Indiana, was a potentially very threatening candidate. He had the downside of having been a budget director in the Bush administration, which, is not exactly a credential that you want to brandish. But he also had an interesting record as governor of Indiana. Yeah. He had a kind of plain-spokenness that was appealing, and he wasn't a crazy right-winger.
Right.
But that, it turns out, was disqualifying for him when it came to getting the Republican nomination. I mean, Mitch Daniels said at one point, and obviously I was watching all of this very closely, he said, I don't believe that these social issues should be at the forefront of what
you wanted a truce.
Talking about. Yeah, and he almost never was heard from again. Yeah. There was such outrage in the Republican base. Yeah. Here's the point: when the day after the midterm elections, I said to the president, everybody was hanging crepe, everybody was stunned, and I said to the president, this is, I think the seeds of our re-elect have been planted here. And he looked at me as if I was crazy. But the reason was that it was clear to me that the most strident voices in the Republican Party were now in control of the party and the process, and that whomever was the nominee was either going to come from that base or was going to have to make so many accommodations with that base that they were going to be impeached for purposes of winning a general election. Romney was willing to make those bargains. A lot of others weren't and didn't run. I think that it was the process itself it was inevitable that they were going to yield someone who was going to be vulnerable. Now, the fact that Romney was also, kind of an exemplar of was the Thurston Howell character, was obviously also helpful. Yeah. But I think the condition of the Republican Party was going to yield a candidate who was going to have difficulty winning a general election. And, I know we're going to move forward. It's the ongoing challenge for the Republican Party. Are they going to be an old, white, Southern evangelical party, or are they going to be a party that can win a national election? They haven't figured out how to solve that problem yet, and finding a bunch of kids who know how to aggregate data isn't going to help them.
No, it just occurred to me that, when Bill Clinton emerged after 3 straight Democratic losses, he had to challenge some of the orthodoxies of his own party.
He did. And
had he run as Walter Mondale or Mike Dukakis, he would not ever have been.
But it did take several cycles.
Well, it took 3 straight losses.
Right. And the question is, do they go through one more cycle where, like one of my Republican friends, Mike Murphy, great Republican consultant, wonderful guy. We did a thing together the other day in front of an audience, and he said his concern is the Cruz scenario, that they'll take a Ted Cruz, who he'll stampede the process, somebody like that, and that they'll have a McGovern, Mondale type experience. But it may take that to cause them to do the soul searching that's necessary.
Okay, let's move forward a bit, and I should say the framing of some of these questions I'm going to ask you stems from the notion that for every when a president's reelected, the inevitable question rises of is the second term curse real? This notion. And my theory about this is almost everything about the second term curse has happened in a president's first term. Watergate, yes. Monica, the Iraq War. So I want to look at some of the things that have happened in the first term and ask you whether you see in them potential dangers for the second term. I mean, we frame it other ways, but that's how I'm going, and you're free to say, Jeff, you ignorant slut, or whatever you might say.
I'll play along. It's your show.
But a more general question. Obama's job approval rating since the re-election, they now stand around 47%, interesting number given Mitt Romney's. That's a fairly measurable drop since the start of the second term, or maybe it's not. I mean, I don't know. Do you think that that's any cause for concern on the part of the president?
Well, it depends on how you you're thinking about this. Obviously, there are midterm elections coming up. His rating can impact on those. But he's not running for election. And one of the things that happens in Washington is that there's an obsession with this number. And more generally, we've become obsessed with the process of electing presidents to the point where the campaigns never stop. And so this is the biggest news around, well, the president's approval, even though he's never running again. But I think it is a reflection of a couple of things. One is there's always a bit of a boost after you win. But secondly, there's no doubt, and we saw the numbers on Friday, that largely because of the sequester, the economy has slowed down. There's been at periods during this period we've seen some higher gas prices. I mean, there are things that are impacting on people that have soured them perhaps on the economy a bit. I think that's been impactful. I also think, I'm a big believer in this movement for gun safety laws. I grew up in New York. I live in Chicago. I'm tired of seeing, I think the Newtown parents are heroic, and their loss is inconceivable. Give them a hand, yes. The fact that they were willing to mobilize the way they did, they can't save their own children, but in order to save other people's children, is so admirable. But I think we also ought to recognize that there are grieving parents in communities across this country almost every day. And so I've really, I applaud the president's efforts, and I know how passionate he was. There's nothing that impacts him more than kids when bad things happen to children. That's, I know him so well, and I mean, he called me when the Newtown story came in, and or he emailed me. He said, it's the first time I've cried in the Oval Office. So he felt very strongly about it. But there's been a big focus on that. There's been a focus on immigration reform, also very important. And I think that we can get that done. But we haven't been talking about the economy very much in the last few months, and I think that has something to do with it as well.
Now, one of the things that's struck me is that you're taking, I don't mean you, I identify you meaning the Obama administration, because
right.
The president's been taking some heat from his own side of things a fair amount. Just today, actually I guess it was Friday, Ezra Klein, he of the Washington Post, one of the
very bright
young guys, and no conservative he.
No,
His column says the Democrats have lost on sequestration. And his point, which I've heard echoed, is that when the president signed the bill easing the airline delays, the argument was, oh, I see. If the sequestration has an impact on business types, upper middle class types, people who travel regularly, the Congress and the president will rush to fix that. But they ain't opening the closed Head Start, closed classrooms, and they're not easing the pain of the delays in chemotherapy treatment for poor people. So as Klein puts it, the pain of sequestration will be concentrated on those who lack political power. Given the president's, I won't exactly call it populist, but maybe I will, notion that we've really got to think about the people who are not the most privileged. Does Ezra Klein have a point that the Democrats and the president, by doing this, have made a very unfortunate signal that if you want things fixed, you better have clout?
Well, I did tweet right after the, I'm embarrassed to use that phrase, but I did tweet as soon as that vote passed the House that they, that Congress in almost unprecedented fashion came together in a united front and dealt with this problem, and then ran off to the airport to leave for the weekend. So, I'm sensitive to that point. I also do think that, this was the transfer of a very small amount of money within the FAA budget, and you do, when you're president, you have to measure a whole lot of things. One of them is, moving goods and services and people across the country. And on balance, he made the decision that it was best to do that. I mean, you could take a different view, which is let's inflict as much pain as possible. And
well, or if we're going to inflict
but
less
I'm not
pain,
sure-
let's choose the people who are in most need of help.
Right. Well, I'm sure that if the president were sitting here, he would heartily agree with you. And you, I know, you've got a fancy Yale Law School degree, so you know that there's a
Right to the ad hominem argument, don't you?
This is the guy who starts me off on Elliot Spitzer and John Edwards.
It's all right. It's all right. I can take the heat, Axelrod.
So, we do have a constitutional government. We do have a Senate. We do have a Congress. I mean, I don't think he's the first president who wonders about the wisdom of that on some days. We need to fight within the Congress to deal with those things. And this budget fight that's coming up is going to be the occasion for that. And so, you can argue both ways. Ezra believes that we should have inconvenienced people at the airports, and that may have produced a better result. I'm not sure that that's the case.
You're talking, I think, here about a much broader issue that faces anybody like a president, which is...
If there is anybody like a president.
Well, okay, fair enough. Faces any president, but I meant any political leader,
Yeah.
which is how do you balance out good and bad?
Yeah.
And this is familiar territory to a lot of us. But speaking of which, you talked about gun safety, and I raised this in a column. So you've got two Democrats up for re-election next year in tough states. You've got Begich in Alaska and Pryor in Arkansas, who voted against gun safety. Now, I know the thing wouldn't have gotten 60 votes without them. So the president called out everybody who voted against this. He used some pretty strong language. I can't remember.
He did also make the point that 90% of the Democrats supported it, and 90% of Republicans
But my
opposed
point
it.
is, you had a guy who I think you know pretty well, William Daley, a former White House chief of staff, brother.
I know him so well, I call him Bill.
I call him Mr. Daley. I don't know him at all. But who said, I'm not giving a dime to these people. So my question is, if you're the president, you've got a tough fight to keep the Senate. On the other hand, you've got these two, not to mention Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota, with 5.5 years left in her term, who also voted against it. Do you say, don't come to me for fundraisers, don't expect me to help? You guys shafted me on, I'm sure he doesn't talk that way, you guys disappointed me on a major issue. Or
I'm sure he'd use that word.
Okay. Or does he say, you know what? Keeping the Senate in Democratic hands is so much more important than any one vote. I'm going to be there for Begich. I'm going to be there for Pryor because I need them on so many other things.
Well, let's talk real politics for a second. I don't know what calculations went on in the White House during this period, but here's what I do know. If they had voted, if each one of them had voted for this law, we would have gotten 58 votes. It wouldn't have passed, and because we needed 60. And when Kelly Ayotte of New Hampshire, who was one of the targets, who everybody felt was perhaps likely to vote for it because New Hampshire, a lot of New Hampshire's in that Boston media market, and she seemed to have the latitude to do it. When she said no, it was clear we weren't going to get 60 votes on that. So now here's the question: if you're the President of the United States, this is a hard vote for these people. Do you use all the political capital you have and compel them? I saw my friend Maureen Dowd's column on this. And look, I don't single her out because I think I've written a political column. It's great to be a columnist and live up there in this world of what you would like to see instead of the world as it is. Do you say to these people, look, I know we're not going to win this vote, but I have to have you vote for it, and if you don't, I'm not going to campaign for you, and I'm not going to support you, and so on. Is that smart to do? Essentially, in politics, they said, make them walk the plank. And I'm not sure that would have been the smartest thing to do. I am hopeful that there'll be another turn of the wheel on this, and I think it could come after the Republican, after the filing process is done in the Republican primary process, when there are Republican senators who no longer are looking over their right shoulder and worried about a primary
In
challenge.
fact, Mike Murphy, who I had dinner with drink with last night, that's how incestuous this is, said precisely that one of the mistakes here may have been timing. Or maybe you can revisit it again, that the point about this is the Republicans who might vote for you are worried about being primaried by a Tea Party NRA candidate. So if you put this bill in, this is real politics with a vengeance. If you wait till the filing deadlines for the primaries are over in 2014, when these Republicans know they can't face a primary challenge, and then put a bill like this in, you at least have maybe a chance of getting a couple of them enough to do that.
And it really underscores something that, everybody is like astonished when politicians act like politicians. I mean, their job, in their view, or their mission is to get reelected. When JFK wrote Profiles in Courage, the reason those people stood out was because it wasn't the norm to do things that risked your political career. It was the unusual to do something that risked your political career. Most politicians don't do that. For a lot of them, this is the best job they'll ever have. They want to keep it. And even though 90% of Americans say they support background checks, and I'm sure they do, and a lot of them, by the way, also believe that they're already in place, and they're only in place for about 60% of gun sales, even though there is this broad feeling out there, the question is, would that cause people to vote against someone? Right. And one thing I say to the folks who in the gun safety movement is, you want to see progress on this issue, defeat a few people who voted against it. And then I think you'll get people's attention, because right now all the energy in terms of electoral activity has been on the side of the NRA. And I want to, since I'm here and I'm a shameless panderer, I want to give the mayor credit, Mayor Bloomberg, for showing the leadership that he has on this. I would actually do this in any other city as well, so I'm not really pandering. But, he promises to commit resources, as does Gabby Giffords, the resource of her time as well as what she can raise, to holding people accountable for these votes. We saw what happened to Senator Ayotte. Her approval rating dropped precipitously in New Hampshire after she cast this vote. I think when politicians begin to believe that it actually is threatening to their existence as office holders, you're going to see movement on this issue.
I mean, it is interesting that Pat Toomey, who, very conservative from Pennsylvania, where there is a fairly strong gun rights movement, was the co-author with the Senator Manchin of West Virginia of the background check bill. So he may be looking at those suburban women
There's
in
no
Philadelphia
doubt about
and
it. It was
Pittsburgh.
I give him credit for it. I really do. But it also was it was a very shrewd move for him, because the swing vote in the state of Pennsylvania is in those suburban areas where there is strong sentiment for these gun safety laws, and he probably took a big step forward in terms of ensuring his own reelection down the line by sponsoring this. The guy who actually, I think, showed a great deal of courage on this was Joe Manchin from West Virginia. Now, he just got reelected, so he had a little latitude to do that, but that is plainly not a state where there's a whole lot of gun safety movement activists, and there's a big NRA presence. When he ran for reelection, one of the things that one of his ads had him shooting a target, and the target was the cap and trade bill.
Literally, he took a rifle and shot the legislation.
Yes.
Which you don't usually see. You're not going to see Chuck Schumer running that ad anytime soon, I think
No.
it's fair to say.
No.
You
could
just talk it to
talk.
death.
Yeah, you could talk it to death, right?
Okay.
So I thought he actually showed
Yeah.
a great deal of courage on that.
Let me raise two other things, and they fall into the rubric of things that happen in the first term that I am hypothesizing could be a problem down in the second term. One of them is Affordable Care Act. And the reason I'm raising this is, for all of the hue and cry of it, most of it only starts kicking in this year, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the good stuff kicked in, if you're 26,
Patient
you
protections
can say,
and yes.
Now we're going to see where the rubber meets the road. And it turns out, it's not going to bend the cost curve. According to, I'm not talking about what Republicans are saying, the analysis of this bill is it's not going to help on cost. Individuals who try to buy health insurance are going to wind up spending more, not less. And it now turns out that one of the principal arguments that Obama made was if you like your health plan, you'll be able to keep it. Maybe not. Employers may be able to push people off employer-based health care into this. My question is, if by 2014, the Affordable Care Act is causing, and it's an enormously complicated bill, whatever you think about it, it ain't like Medicare. You're over 65, here's your health care. Could this wind up being a real political liability?
And it was made much more complicated by the sort of circuitous route we had to take to get there. There's no question about it. I mean, I would, on a couple of fronts, the answer to your question is yes, it is a difficult, this to me is the greatest challenge for him in the second term. This is something that he spent enormous political currency on. I admire him for doing it. He did it with full knowledge. I remember when we had the discussion about whether he should do it, and I was, and others, and I have very mixed feelings about it because as a person, I have a child with a chronic illness. We went through the terror of not only dealing with a potentially life-threatening illness, my daughter had intractable epilepsy and seizures we couldn't stop, but also the terror of potential bankruptcy because our insurance wouldn't cover her medications, which cost $1,000 a month or more. And I was a reporter at that time, and you remember that didn't pay very well. So on the one hand, I felt the urgent need for this, but on the other hand, as a political matter, my job was to advise him on the politics of it. The politics were terrible because people were very sensitive to anything that might threaten their health care and the government getting, even the hint of government involvement, even though he proposed a kind of market solution to it. So, and he said, look, we've been trying to do this as a country for 65 years. The system's going to implode if we don't do something. And while, yes, some of the studies say it won't bend the cost curve in the short run, the question is over time if reforms are employed. And we have a monstrously inefficient healthcare system. You've probably heard these numbers quoted on this stage 100 times. But, we pay 17% of our GDP for healthcare. The next country down spends 11% of their GDP, and we don't have better outcomes. In most cases, we have worse outcomes among the major industrialized countries. So there are enormous inefficiencies in the system, and so I think over the long term you will get the savings, but that said, it is a very, very difficult process. And one of the big issue right now is that these health insurance exchanges, when you say people's premiums will go up within these, they'll be paying more, the issue is whether healthy young people will enter the exchanges, right, the so-called invulnerables, or will you be stuck with exchanges that mostly include older, unhealthy people, and in which case, the cost is going to be way up. So the big effort in the next few months, not just on the part of the government, but it should be on the part of the insurance industry. Because remember, all the requirements on the insurance industry are in place. The payoff for them was 30 million new customers. If that doesn't materialize, they're in a bad position. So they really have a vested interest in getting on board here. And the other problem, Jeff, and just I know you asked a
it's
relatively
okay.
trimmed question, and I'm giving you a very long answer, but the other thing we have to cope with is snipers on every rooftop, because you've got a Congress, Republican Congress, that would like to see this fail for the reasons that you suggest, and you have governors across the country Republican governors who have resisted this reform, who would like to see it fail. And so there are a lot of obstacles, but he knew it was going to be hard when he undertook it. And when he ran for president, he ran on the premise that he was going to do hard things because we couldn't defer them for another generation. This is one of those things, and I applaud him for doing it. Is it fraught? Yes. Is it difficult? Yes. But it's worth the effort.
My response to that is, at some point, maybe not in the next 4 years, maybe not in the next 10 years, somebody is going to bite the bullet on the Democratic side, even if it takes a couple of election cycles, and say, you know what? We have got to go single payer. Because it's not even a philosophical thing. It's that I've talked about this with David Brooks yesterday. The same thing happened with Hillary Care. When you put when you put a health care bill, which is always the most sensitive thing, even if one is not going through the terrors that you and your wife had to go through with your kid. Anybody, health care is like, if people don't understand it, it's almost certain that it's going to be fraught with all kinds of problems. I think right now, even people who have good coverage, when they get those forms, it's like a shot through the brain. My God, how.
Yeah, I agree with that. Look, one of the problems with it, you started with references to some of my former clients, but just let me pile on in an exercise in self-flagellation. Let me acknowledge that I was the one in the White House who was, I was there for the 2 years when we were doing the health care bill, and messaging came under my rubric. One of the challenges we faced was 85% of Americans have coverage, 15% don't. And the way the debate was almost inevitably depicted, no matter how hard we tried to shake it in the media, was this was a $1 trillion program to bring health care to 30 million Americans who didn't have it. And so for all the other Americans who did have it, they didn't feel like they had a benefit, they were going to benefit. Now the fact is there are extraordinary benefits, end of caps, kids up to 26, a whole array of benefits that accrue to people who have insurance as a result of this law. But we could never get the focus on that.
Understood, and it's why Pat Moynihan 20 years ago, half-jokingly, but not half-jokingly, said, why don't we just take he didn't say it that way, why don't we just take the Medicare bill and strike out over 65?
And that was, I think that was an idea that was considered. It's an expensive proposition.
Exactly. The other thing I wanted to raise with you is when we're looking about things that could rise up and bite the president in an unpleasant place, is Afghanistan. And I raise this because there's a new book out called The Indispensable Nation. It's by a guy who worked for Dick Holbrooke. His name, I think, is Vali Nasser.
Yes.
He has some pretty rough things to say about the Obama diplomacy. What he says, I'm summarizing a whole book here in 30 seconds, is diplomacy was the Obama administration basically turned over the judgment on foreign policy to a group of insular White House aides who only cared about politics. He didn't mention you. I don't know if he has you in mind, but he was very critical. He says in the book, it took Clinton forever to get her point of view across. They cut Holbrooke out of the process. They wouldn't let Holbrooke try to make a deal with the Taliban. And I read just today that the departing French ambassador from Afghanistan had some very pessimistic things to say about the future. That's a long-winded way of asking you, are you confident that where you are in Afghanistan, I don't mean you personally, I mean the Obama administration, is going to yield what you hope it will yield?
I am confident that, look, let's go back to just for a second, in order to go forward, let me go back to where we were when we arrived. And let me say parenthetically, Vali Nasser was Dick Holbrooke's right-hand person. and his view was framed by Holbrooke's experience. I'm not sure that Secretary Clinton would second all of those notions or embrace the idea that she was somehow fenced off from these decisions.
He says that it was very tough for her to get. He says she ultimately did, but it was a battle. But I don't want to.
But beyond that,
Yeah.
when we arrived, we basically had 7 years of drift in Afghanistan, because instead of pursuing Bin Laden and Al Qaeda after the attack, we famously went in a different direction in Iraq, and Afghanistan just sat there for years. So there was no strategy there. And the question the president asked was, what do we need to do to put ourselves in a position where we can lead? And that was the goal. And the last conversation that I had with Dick Holbrooke was on the day that he died. He was in my office right before he went to see Hillary Clinton. And in that conversation, he said, we need to pursue both paths. He wasn't arguing for diplomacy. He said, in fact, that you have to keep up the military effort in order to make any diplomacy effective. So, that's the path that has been pursued. It's a monstrously complicated thing. And one thing you should certainly get the impression of from this conversation is being president isn't all that great sometimes. It's I saw those 5 presidents on Thursday together, and everybody said, well, how could the president say such nice things about George W. Bush and so on? I think anybody who's worked in the White House, and I'm one of them, comes away with a much more profound respect for anybody else who's ever worked there, and certainly anybody who's sat in that Oval Office, because nothing comes to that desk that isn't almost impossible. Because everything that's easy gets solved somewhere else. They only kick the stuff up to the president that is hard. And this one, of course, is among the hardest. And so, the president developed a strategy with both his diplomatic and his military advisors that ultimately with the goal of bringing our troops home by the end of 2014. And I think he's going to hold to that. What the state of Afghanistan is going to be at that time, I think, is the question that is on people's minds. But I do know this. We cannot be there endlessly. We've been there longer than we've ever been in any war, and it's time to bring those troops home.
I remember more than 20 years ago, when the late Congressman Joe Wilson was surreptitiously getting stingers and stuff to the Mujahideen so they could beat the Soviets, who then turned into the Taliban. Somebody said that you have to understand about Afghanistan that the principal driving emotion of every Afghan is vengeance. That is, that it's organized around avenging the ill that was done to your great-great-grandfather's cousin, and that's a tough country to try to turn into Sweden.
Yeah.
I want to turn to the audience questions, many of which are fascinating, but I need to bridge by asking you the question that a very smart audience member, not me, asked David Plouffe. I'll phrase it exactly the way it was phrased to David. David, same name.
Yes.
It's late 2015, or practically early 2015. The phone rings. It's Hillary Clinton. She says, David, I'm going. Run my campaign. And you say,
you must be calling David Plouffe.
Okay. Perhaps the import of the question was, are you done?
Yes. Well, yes, I am. I am done. Look, I'm not disinterested, and I care deeply about this, and I have ever since I was a little boy. I always say I started as an idealist. I've told the story. Some of you may have been here before about when I was 5 years old, going to JFK, it was October 27, 1960, JFK came through Stuyvesant Town. Last 10 days of the election, when New York was still a swing state. And he had a rally in Stuyvesant Town, and the woman who took care of me when my mother was at work put me on top of, named Jessie Berry, kind of raised me, put me on top of this mailbox so I could see this. And that was it. It just seemed very important. I didn't understand all of it, but it seemed like this was something that I should care about. And, I'm an idealist, and I've had some twists and turns, and you named a few of them. But I always say to Obama that the gift he gave me was he helped me get my idealism back. So of course I'm going to be interested in what happens in 2016. But I also think there's a time, one other thing that I always said from the time that I was a young guy in this business was, if I were still doing it when I was 60, then just shoot me. Because it's really it's hard, it is an incredibly debilitating thing. It's exhilarating, but I went through this last campaign like the old athlete who announced at the beginning of the season that he was going to retire at the end of the season, and it made it a very pleasurable experience for me. Every event, every city we went to, I had memories of past campaigns and all of that. But you know what? What am I going to do that's going to exceed what I've already done? I think this is a good time to say, let's let that's why I'm doing this institute. I want young people to get in there and do this work.
So you're the Mariano Rivera of 2012.
Yes, exactly.
He blew a couple of big saves. I don't mean that it's perfect. He was just a pretty impressive guy.
And luckily I came to the conclusion without having to blow out my knee.
Right. Okay. These questions that you will see vary widely from intensely sincere to
grossly insincere.
Insincere is the wrong word.
Let me rate them as they come.
Yeah, you can rate them. Okay. What do you suggest to get money out of politics, and what do you think about limiting or even banning political ads on television?
Well, first of all, I've watched this. I was a firebrand reformer, and my instincts are still there. I think the pervasiveness of money in politics is really frightening, and the Citizens United stuff has just opened the doors so wide to that. But what I've also found is that every time we enact a reform, we basically create a cottage industry for lawyers who find ways to circumvent them. And so we haven't made the system cleaner, we've just made it sneakier. And so now, you have all these outlets where people can write unlimited checks, and we never know where the money's coming from. And I don't know that you can, you can't put that genie back in the bottle. And I said, and Fred Wertheimer was very mad at me for saying it, I'm not sure about this, but I'm at the point where I'm wondering whether we shouldn't just say, look, we're just not going to have any limits, but we're going to make a disclosure, a failure to disclose a really serious crime.
Yeah, but then you're going to get the independent expenditures thing, and the Supreme Court won't let you do that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I don't have a fancy Yale degree, okay? So I don't know all the answers to this.
But if you tell me you're just a humble country pundit.
But one thing about this is I always felt like we were attacking this from the wrong side. We attack it from the supply side instead of the demand side. The reason that money is important in politics is because it costs so much to communicate. And so I don't know that the answer, people get information whether we like it or not through television, and I don't know that banning television advertising is the answer, because it locks in a tremendous advantage for incumbents. If you do that, they're on the news every night. They have a platform from which to speak, and then the challengers are in the dark. I'm not sure that's the answer. I always thought the answer was to really compel. This will really further endear me to my friends at NBC, but to compel the networks and broadcasting outlets to provide even greater discounts or free time for candidates. So we have some non-broadcast executives here.
The way NBC's ratings are going, they're probably giving these ads away for free now. So I don't know.
Okay, now you said that.
Yes, I did. The only network I never worked for. We also should put on the table that in 2008, the first candidate to blow out all limits for both the primary and general election spending was Barack Obama, because you could.
Well, it also was because we watched what happened with the swift boat veterans and so on, and we were really worried about,
I got you.
about that. So yes, we made that decision, and we were able to do it largely because we had developed this huge grassroots fundraising base.
Okay, Professor Axelrod.
This could be the less than sincere question, huh?
Actually, it isn't. I'm impressed by the title. So no more elitism from you, pal. You're a professor. Who did you consider to be your toughest competitors or counterparts in the McCain or Romney campaigns? Who on the other side of the aisle, as a political type? You mentioned Mike Murphy, who was pretty impressive.
Yeah, and Mike was my big fear Mike had done McCain's campaign in 2000, which was really a smart, well-conceived campaign and almost toppled George W. Bush. And my great and he had done Mitt Romney's campaign for governor in Massachusetts in 2006, or 2002, I should say. And my concern was that Mike would come back and get involved in the Romney campaign, and it would be a different campaign, because Mike would have known what I think they should have known. They made a judgment that it was enough to get, that all you had to do was get the nomination, because Barack Obama was so vulnerable that just being the nominee was enough. And so they were willing to pay any price for that nomination. I think Mike would have told them, you've got to find some place where you can stand up to the base. And so instead of going the farthest to the right on immigration, maybe you should stand up on it. I think that would probably have been the one he would have chosen. Don't go get into a debate with Rick Santorum and try to get the right of him on contraception. That's not a smart strategy. Mike would have known that. And I think those guys did too, but I think they made a judgment, So Murphy was a guy, but he wasn't in those, he wasn't in the 2008 campaign either, because he didn't want to choose between Romney and McCain.
He's a very impressive fellow, and also one of the funnier people that I've ever met.
He is, yes.
Sense of humor goes a long way in politics, I think.
Yeah.
This is a
it's
strange
survival technique.
Will Christie join the Democratic Party? I told you these questions vary greatly. And,
yes.
No, I think. Can we agree on this?
Yes, I think I can say that.
Do you think he's is he got national chops? You think?
Well, if you look at the polling, he's the most formidable Republican candidate in a general election, and he's the least nominatable candidate in the Republican primary, which speaks to the dilemma of the Republican Party. The Republicans are angry at him because he had a kind word to say about the president in the midst of a natural disaster of matched proportions here, and a couple of other offenses. I mean, I think he's a solidly conservative guy. My real question about Christie is, I mean, you have no idea, you do, but some of you may not, just how irritating the process of running for president can be. And I mean, you are scrutinized and, examined every moment, every remark you make, every, raised eyebrow is analyzed. And I just don't know how much patience he'd have for that process. I mean, he's kind of the Ralph Cramden of American
Yes, but
politics.
you see, it's exactly right. But I have this is the part of me that's a Marxist, a Groucho Marxist, not a Karl Marx.
Yes.
Is that might be, up to a point, an amazingly attractive point. A politician, I mean, the guy who chases a critic down the boardwalk, I suggested that his slogan, if he runs, is, "Hey, numbnuts, I'm talking to you." Now, maybe that's more a New York kind of campaign, an Ed Koch, Giuliani
Well,
campaign.
no, but I mean, I think there's something to that. And I think that has charm, the first 10 times.
Yeah, I get the point.
But over the course of a long campaign, I think that would be difficult. But it does speak to a point that's important, which is, I think that a leading indicator in a candidate, a successful candidate for president, is authenticity. And if, when you think about the last several campaigns, generally the more authentic candidate wins. And the one thing that he is authentic. And so, that's a quality. But, this authenticity thing reminds me of what George Burns used to say about show business. He said, all you need to succeed in show business is sincerity, and if you can fake that, you got it made. So.
Ted Koppel said the same thing about Journal. He loved that line. Last week, David Brooks opined, said that if Obama had reached out in his first term to Republicans the way he's now doing with the dinners and the schmoozing, he might have accomplished a lot more.
Yeah, I know. And look, I like David a lot. As was mentioned, we've led parallel lives. He grew up about 100 yards from me in Stuyvesant Town. He followed me at the University of Chicago, although he apparently attended class. And then he started in Chicago journalism when I was working for the Tribune, and he worked for the fabled City News Bureau there. But David has the luxury of living in, he's a guy who, conceives of the world that he wants to live in and believes that it can be. And sometimes the world is more challenging and more difficult. This notion that, that everybody will lock arms, he misses that fundamental point, which the fundamental rule that I mentioned earlier, which is that the first instinct of politicians is survival. And in his world, it should be, and I admire him for his feelings about this. I agree with him. He thinks it should be, the commonweal should come first, and that people should come together. And it's just not always that way. And the president, I was there. I was there when the president brought in a leading Republican senator who would have been very, very important in the healthcare debate, and said, okay, this is what I believe. What do you believe? They went on for 2 hours. At the end of it, the president said, well, it's like we agree on 99% of this. Can you support this? And he said, not unless you get 10 other Republicans. I can't step out there on my own. And, Mitch McConnell said in January of 2010, in the same paper that David Brooks works for, said, we made a decision right from the beginning that we weren't going to give him support on any major issue because then it would have signified to people that he had figured it all out, and we weren't going to give him that victory. So when you have a strategy of opposition and obstruction, a political strategy of obstruction, this isn't about whether or not, you've broken bread enough with these guys. They made a judgment. That was their strategy. I think it helped them in 2010. I think it was part of what helped defeat them in 2012.
You alluded to this, but the question is, how much did you pay Clint Eastwood to do his act at the Republican convention? I
know, but we were joking with the president that he was going to get a call the day after election, and it was going to be from some blocked number, and he was going to pick it up, and there was going to be a gravelly voice saying, you owe me one.
You alluded to 2010. I'm trying to find the exact phrase of this question because it's very piquant, but it went something like this. It was, if the Republican Party, the phrase knucklehead showed up, and here it is. If the Republican members of Congress didn't pay the price with the group of knuckleheads they put forth in their presidential primaries and Senate races in 2012, what makes you think they can pay a price in the midterm elections of 2014?
I don't think I said that.
That's what I'm. So
yeah.
You think?
I'm not suggesting that that knuckleheads can't prevail. And one of the things that's important to note is the stark difference between midterm election electorates and general presidential year electorates. I mean, you're talking about 60 million more people or thereabouts voting.
And they're mostly tending to your side of things.
They do strongly. They're more
they're younger, blacker, browner,
more mobile,
better educated.
Yes. And so the great challenge for the Democratic Party is, can you find a way to mobilize these voters in the off year? And I think that's a big open question. But I'll give you an example. 18% of the electorate in 2008 were under 30 years old. only 12% in the 2010 election. That makes a huge difference, and the same is true on some of the other base constituencies that we have. So, I mean, one of the goals has to be to do a much better job of mobilizing these sporadic voters.
It does interest me. I don't know what to make of this, Dave. I really don't. That the only incumbent president to see his party gain seats in a 6th year, going back, I think, to almost the whole 20th century, was Bill Clinton, who was in the middle of a humongous sex scandal.
Yes.
I'm not suggesting this is a strategy for the president, although you have worked for Eliot Spitzer and John Edwards. But
Didn't work that well for them.
yeah, but it does suggest that, I mean, if one were being, if in your position were being, pessimistic, you'd say, based on history and based on how the 2014 elections line up with a lot of
Yeah, I mean, look,
seats.
let's be clear. We've got a bunch of retirements. I think that we'll actually do fairly well, as the Democratic Party will do fairly well in a lot of these retired seats. I think, even in Montana, if Governor Schweitzer runs, he would be the odds-on favorite to hold on to a seat that otherwise would be difficult.
West Virginia
but West Virginia, I think, is the one that is most in jeopardy of the retirees. Iowa, I think, where Tom Harkin's retiring, Bruce Braley is the candidate congressman. I think he's the favorite to win that race. I think in Michigan we have a good chance to hold on to that seat. But where the problem is when you look at the incumbents who are running for re-election in the states that they're from, Mary Landrieu from Louisiana, Arkansas, Mark Pryor in Arkansas, Begich in Alaska, and Kay Hagan in North Carolina. I mean, these are hard seats. That said, I think the Republicans would have to win 6, a net 6 to win, and I think the odds are that Democrats will hang on. Now, as far as the House goes, I think the odds are that the Republicans will retain control of the House.
The thing that the event that I think would produce the most, from a selfish journalistic point of view, fascinating story is if you come in with a diminished number of Democrats in the Senate, whether you hold it or not, and a conservative member of the Supreme Court retires. I think we'd put that on pay-per-view. I think that would be a brawl for the ages.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, we know what the balance is right now, and
that's what I mean.
Yeah, I think even with the it would be a battle even with the makeup as we have it today.
I've told you that you don't have to be a member of the bar to be nominated for the Supreme Court.
Yes, but you do have to be confirmable.
Okay. Petty, petty, petty.
But then you also have to have either a Yale or a Harvard Law degree, apparently. So you're almost there.
I'm halfway home.
Yeah.
I would just like to do it so I could deal with, as I told you, my erotic fantasy is to be up for confirmation so I could tell the senators exactly what I think of their brains. It's another reason you don't...
say that you can come to work and you didn't have to wear pants.
There you go.
So.
Right. Something your clients might have kept in mind, by the way.
I wanted to see how agile you were. So I just lobbed it up
Thank
there
you.
and you swung at it. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sweet hanging curve. Who will go down as a better president, Bill Clinton or Barack Obama?
Well, thank you for that question. Look, Bill Clinton is an enormously bright and talented guy, and I think he did some things that were, very courageous, including, by the way, raising taxes in 1993. And many of the same things that were said about President Obama were said of Bill Clinton then, that this is the end of the economy and so on. And, the steps that he took then were instrumental in helping unleash the growth that we saw at the end of that decade. But he did have the advantage of governing during a time of enormous growth. And this president has had the burden of governing through the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. And what I will tell you is that I think what I will always remember from my 2 years at the White House at his side was the abject terror of arriving at the White House when your economic advisors were telling you there was a 1 in 3 chance of a second Great Depression, and that if we didn't act quickly, that would happen. You know, we had this meeting at the in the transition office in Chicago on December 16th of 2008, and the economic advisors ran through the forecast, and Christy Romer, who was coming in to head the Council of Economic Advisors, who was an expert on the Great Depression, said this is going to be the worst downturn since the Great Depression. Larry Summers said trillions of dollars will be lost in growth and millions of jobs would be lost. Tim Geithner said the financial system was locked up and wasn't lending and could collapse. And then Peter Orszag, the budget director, cheered everybody up by saying, and this is going to add trillions of dollars to the deficits even before we take steps to deal with this. And so, you know, we came to office in a really grave time, and I saw him make a series of decisions, each of which were as necessary as they were unpopular. The Recovery Act, which is much maligned, but I think was very much instrumental in pulling us out of the tailspin we were in. The TARP and the steps that were taken to shore up the financial system. We had to take that from the Bush folks and refine it. That was we would not have an economy if we didn't have a functioning financial system. And there's plenty of debate to be had in here. That's why I raise it at the end of our session, because I know that it would occasion a lot more questions. But the point is, and then the third was the auto bailout. And I was in the room when he made that decision. And I had all the polling data, and the polling data said even in Michigan people didn't want us to intervene. And he made a series of decisions that were unpopular, but he knew that it was his duty to make them. And I think history will look back and say at a time of maximum peril for the country, he put the well-being of the country ahead of his own political interests, and that's what you want in a leader.
It is a little hard to remember that in 2000, one of the central debates between Bush and Gore was, what are we going to do with all this money?
Yeah. Well, Bush resolved it.
Okay. Just a couple more. I am 17 years old and in high school. What advice would you give to a student just starting his political career?
First of all, I applaud you wherever you are for considering a career in politics. I mean, I have this Institute of Politics, so I would encourage you to go to the University of Chicago as well. But I have this Institute of Politics, and one of the major reasons I have it is because we need good, well-motivated, smart people to come into the system. It's easy to avert your eyes and say, I don't want to be a part of that. But as I say to all of the young people that I deal with, and I say to this young person who offered this question, every equity you care about, like I think this is the most public-spirited group of young people that I've seen since the 1960s. I think kids care deeply about the world and they want to impact on it, and you see it in the number of kids who are going into Teach for America and some of these other programs, and I see it on campus. But there's profound doubt as to whether the political system is the way to affect that change. And what I say to young people, and I say to this young person, is everything you care about, whether it's climate change or education or human rights, everything that you care about is going to be impacted by the decisions that are made in Washington, in state capitals, and in city halls across this country, and in capitals around the world. And you either get in there and try and change things for the better, or live with the consequences of the decisions that are being made. And my hope is to encourage as many young people, and this young person, to to get in there and get involved in campaigns. Choose a candidate who inspires you. Go to work for that candidate. Learn what is entailed in running for public office. If there's not an election going on, volunteer in a legislative office. Look for internships, and groom yourself to become a player in the system. Get in the arena. And if more young people do that, who are well motivated, that's our best hope for the future. So, I mean, that question inspires me. I'm glad that this young person is thinking about that. There are plenty of reasons to look at this system and say, today, and watch the news and say, gee, I don't want to do that. And the fact that this kid does, that's a good sign for our country.
I think another good sign for this country is that people like David Axelrod spend so much time in politics.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.